If you've ever had the uncontrollable urge to dance at a wedding reception where you knew no one, imagine doing that for 6 days straight, in a wool dress, in July, with no DJ, no water breaks, and a town full of onlookers who definitely did not clap on beat. That's pretty much how it all began. In July of 1518, in the sweltering heart of medieval Strasbourg, now in modern-day France, a woman named Frau Trophäa stepped out of her timber-framed house, walked calmly into the street, and began to dance. No music, no celebration, no wedding. She didn't even look particularly happy about it. She just danced. And then she kept dancing, for hours, and then for days. Her neighbors, being the well-adjusted, plague-weary folk that they were, initially assumed she was either possessed, drunk, or suffering from too much blood, which was the go-to medical explanation for pretty much everything that wasn't ghosts in the 1500s. But by day 3, people stopped laughing. Frau Trophäa hadn't eaten. She hadn't slept. Her feet were bleeding. Her face was locked in a kind of grim, involuntary rhythm, like her muscles had been hijacked by the devil's personal choreographer. Her husband begged her to stop. According to whispered accounts, she looked tortured by motion as if her own limbs were rebelling against her. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And hey, post your local time and location in the comments. I want to see where you're watching from, and whether any of you are dancing right now. If you are, blink twice. By the end of the week, Frau Trophäa had been joined by more than 30 other people, each one infected by some unseen groove they could not escape. And it wasn't just peasants either. Bakers, merchants, young men, middle-aged moms. Even a monk was allegedly spotted doing something that looked suspiciously like the worm. People collapsed, wheezing. Some foamed at the mouth. Some reportedly died, though historians still argue whether it was heart attack, stroke, or sheer rhythmic humiliation. And yet, more kept joining in. Frau Trophäa never gave an interview. She left behind no memoir, no diary entries. She didn't even write her name in a cool medieval font. Everything we know about her is filtered through second-hand reports, sensational chronicles, and the fact that someone later tried to name a band after her. They didn't make it. Obviously. Still, the dancing plague of 1518 begins with her an ordinary woman who, for reasons no one has ever fully explained, became the first domino in a very weird, very sweaty chain reaction that would soon consume her entire city. To understand how utterly bizarre this was, you have to imagine the scene: narrow cobblestone streets packed with confused townspeople watching their neighbors collapse mid-cha-cha. No one dared get too close, in case it was contagious. Spoiler, they were right to be nervous. The air was thick with body heat, prayers, and the unmistakable smell of scorched leather shoes. The church was baffled, the local officials were horrified, and the town musicians were probably like, "Do we join in?" Historical records from the time are strangely earnest. One chronicle by the physician Paracelsus, yes, that Paracelsus describes the dancers with a mixture of pity and wow. This is above my pay grade. He noted that many of the victims were otherwise healthy, well-fed, and mentally sound, before they started jamming against their will. It wasn't hysteria from famine or pestilence. It was just dancing. But bad dancing. Like if TikTok challenges caused neurological short circuits. Modern academics call it a case study in collective behavioral phenomena, which is a polite way of saying sometimes the human brain just throws up jazz hands and walks off the stage. There's an ongoing philosophical debate about whether this kind of thing could happen today. Would mass psychogenic illness still spread if we had Twitter? Or would people just record it, hashtag it, and assume it was viral marketing for a new energy drink? It's easy to dismiss Frau Trophäa as a footnote in history. One weird woman who twitched too hard, But make no mistake, she set in motion a full-blown civic crisis. Not because she danced, but because no one could figure out how to make her stop. And just like that, Strasbourg found itself trapped in one of the strangest unsolved medical mysteries of all time. The kind that makes historians sigh, neurologists raise their eyebrows, and podcasters drool. Maybe she just wanted to be alone with her thoughts. Maybe she was running from something internal. Or maybe she was the first person in recorded history to get a song stuck in her head so badly, it literally tried to kill her. She danced like nobody was watching, except, of course, for the entire town. Strasbourg in 1518 wasn't the kind of place you visited for the vibes. It was a booming trade city with all the ambiance of a haunted IKEA, gorgeous timber-framed houses stacked along the Rhine, marketplaces that smelled like 10 types of goat, and a constant hum of existential dread in the air, between wars, famines, plague recurrences, and the ever-looming threat of excommunication for sneezing wrong. The people of Strasbourg were basically just trying not to die before dinner. So when Frau Trophäa began flailing in the street like a one-woman Renaissance rave, the townsfolk were unsurprised, confused, sure, concerned, definitely, but surprised. This was a town that had already seen chickens exorcised, leeches applied to everything from melancholy to marriage problems, and at least one incident involving a goat accused of witchcraft. What made the dancing different was that it didn't stop. It wasn't uncommon in medieval Europe to see strange public behavior. Flagellants, mystics, spontaneous preachers, people screaming about sin while foaming at the mouth, classic Tuesday stuff. But Frau Trophäa's rhythmic trance lasted days, and it didn't look like a holy seizure or religious ecstasy. It looked like she was trying to perform an interpretive routine called Help Me. I am trapped inside my own skeleton. Strasbourg's response was initially a collective shrug. Local priests muttered prayers under their breath. Her neighbors averted their eyes. Her husband tried to drag her inside, reportedly failing when she danced back out like a medieval Roomba with dying batteries. By day 4, she had company. At first, it was just a few young men who either felt sympathy or thought, hey, she's pulling focus. Let's make this a duet. But these weren't coordinated flash mobs. These were frantic, desperate bodies jerking and spinning like puppets with their strings tangled. Within days, the count had risen to a few dozen men, women, even a small child or two sweating, stumbling, clapping, and collapsing. Nobody knew where they were going. Some tried to flee the crowd mid-spin. Some cried while dancing. One man reportedly begged for someone to tie him to a post so he'd stop moving, and still, more kept joining in. This wasn't a cultural thing. There was no festival, no music, no religious prompting. This was July, not carnival season. These people didn't want to dance. They needed to, against their will, like their bodies were possessed by some rhythm born of heat stroke, bad wheat, and unresolved childhood trauma. Here's a true historical fact. Strasbourg had been through a rough patch that year. A string of bad harvests had left many starving. Disease ran wild. Recent flooding had ruined crops, and the poor were packed into cramped, humid houses with no ventilation and no hope. Combine that with extreme religiosity and the belief that divine punishment could be contagious, and you had yourself a pressure cooker of mass anxiety. Enter one woman dancing like her soul was trying to bail. The local authorities, no strangers to weird, watch the dance mob grow with a mix of alarm and that signature medieval cocktail of denial and incense. They had no medical explanation. The idea of mental health was centuries away. What they did have was a pamphlet printed by a local doctor claiming the cause was overheated blood. Yep, hot blood, again. According to the widely accepted Galenic theory of the time, too much heat in the blood could lead to irrational behavior, which is how people back then justified everything from fainting spells to spontaneous beard growth. Meanwhile, the dancers kept boogieing. One woman reportedly spun so hard she cracked her ribs and still kept moving. A man collapsed, vomited, and resumed his jigs mid-purge. Eyewitnesses described faces locked in grimaces of panic, bodies jerking like marionettes caught in a windstorm. Blood soaked into stockings. Feet turned purple. There were screams not of joy, but of panic and pain. What's often missed in retellings of the dancing plague is just how terrifying it must have been to watch. Imagine looking out your window and seeing 20 of your neighbors moonwalking against their will, sobbing openly, then falling unconscious only to rise again 10 minutes later with a twitch and a hop. There was no rhythm, no consistency, just a feverish, contagious compulsion to move. The town square began to smell like heat stroke and hopelessness. And yet, for reasons still debated by historians, more and more people joined in not because they wanted to, but because something inside them snapped. Call it stress response, call it mass hysteria, call it the 1500s version of a group text gone terribly wrong. There is an ongoing academic debate about whether Frau Trophäa and the others had actually fallen victim to a form of collective trauma, a spontaneous release of repression via movement. In a world without Netflix, therapy, or quiet spaces, maybe their brains found the only escape hatch available interpretive agony, a fun but absolutely real off-topic detail while all this was happening. There were also documented reports of spontaneous beard growth rituals in nearby towns, men who believed if their beards grew unevenly, it was a sign of God's wrath. So while one part of Alsace was pirouetting toward death, the other was trimming their whiskers out of fear of eternal damnation. Medieval Europe was nothing if not eventful. By the end of the first week, the dancers numbered in the dozens. Reports vary, some say 50, others as high as 100. Some collapsed and didn't get back up. Others danced themselves into comas. The priests held emergency masses. The town council panicked, and Frau Trophäa, she vanished from the records. Whether she finally stopped, was taken away, or danced herself to death is unknown. She disappears from history as mysteriously as she entered it. But her legacy continued to grow, one frantic step at a time. The dance had begun. You know it's a crisis when your best medical advice is, have you tried not being hot-blooded today, It started like a solo act. But by mid-July, Strasbourg was knee-deep in what can only be described as the first unwilling dance party in recorded history. And unlike most parties, this one had no guest list, no punch bowl, and an extremely high risk of cardiovascular collapse. The number of afflicted grew day by day. At first, people watched from a distance, murmuring prayers or debating if this was some elaborate satire. No one understood. Then they stopped murmuring. Then they stopped watching altogether because suddenly, they were dancing too. In less than 2 weeks, nearly 400 people were reported to be caught in the grip of whatever force had hijacked Frau Trophäa. Some shuffled quietly. Some flailed like their limbs were rebelling. Some tried to mimic the steps of others, hoping there was a secret move that would unlock freedom. Spoiler, there wasn't. And now, the town's leaders had to make a decision, an actual full-body, bureaucratic decision. So naturally, they built a stage. Because in Strasbourg logic, if people were dancing themselves into unconsciousness, the obvious solution was to give them better acoustics. The city council, led by a handful of bewildered nobles and physicians with very large beards, debated how to address the crisis. They ruled out witchcraft early, somewhat surprising for the era, and leaned heavily on the overheated humors theory. Their goal was to help the afflicted purge the madness from their bodies. Translation, let them keep dancing. To encourage this, officials repurposed the town square. They cleared space, roped off spectators, and brought in professional musicians to accompany the dancers' drummers, pipers, even fiddle players. One chronicle mentions bands employed at great expense. which suggests Strasbourg's leaders blew part of the municipal budget trying to out-festival their own mental breakdown. It's worth pausing here to note that this actually happened. The government responded to a medical mystery by turning it into a live performance. It's like if the CDC held a press conference in 2020 and said, "We've decided to add backup singers." And here's a true historical fact. The belief at the time was that if you suffered from dancing mania, you simply hadn't danced enough. The cure was to wear yourself out completely, to let the fever burn through your limbs, like a spiritual detox. Hence the drums, hence the stage, hence the town's descent into a very organized form of chaos. Now picture this, a sweltering public square full of sweating bodies, musicians furiously playing in the background, and onlookers unsure whether to cheer or cry. The dancers themselves were past the point of feeling joy. Their faces looked haunted. Some begged for mercy. Some moved silently, like sleepwalkers. Some clawed at their own clothes to cool down. One woman was seen attempting to pray mid-pirouette, which sounds like something from Cirque du Sadness. People began collapsing en masse. There were no medics, no triage zones, just the occasional priest waving incense in a vague attempt to distract whatever demon was presumably stuck in the crowd's Wi-Fi signal. At least 15 people reportedly died within the first few weeks, though records are murky, and medieval chroniclers weren't exactly known for their peer-reviewed accuracy. Still, eyewitnesses agree that people collapsed mid-dance, convulsed, and then simply never got up. The deaths were attributed to heart attacks, strokes, and in one dramatic case, a man whose shoes were filled with blood. You'd think this would inspire panic, or at least a cease and desist letter from the clergy. Nope. The town doubled down. They moved the dancers to the grain market. When that got crowded, they marched them to a nearby guild hall, where the wooden floors reportedly echoed with hundreds of syncopated footfalls and occasional screams. There are even accounts, unconfirmed, but delightfully absurd, that suggest benches were placed around the perimeter so relatives could watch their loved ones flail. It became a kind of open-air hospital, except the treatment was more cowbell. There's a lingering philosophical debate in academic circles about whether the city's decision to support the dancing helped or hurt. Some argue it prevented panic and offered structure. Others point out that it likely prolonged the outbreak, reinforcing the collective delusion with drums and snacks. A quirky, off-topic detail. Around the same time, in nearby towns, nobles were funding elaborate morality plays, live-action theater, where actors portrayed sins and punishments. These plays were sometimes staged in public squares, where audiences were encouraged to reflect on virtue. Meanwhile, Strasbourg was like, forget morality. We've got a woman doing the medieval Macarena until her knees explode. In one bizarre episode, a small boy who wasn't even dancing was encouraged to start, in case he had dormant humors. He apparently lasted 6 hours before vomiting on the shoes of a nearby merchant and being carried away like a tiny, exhausted gladiator. Even the musicians started breaking down. Some reportedly left town. Others refused to keep playing. One lute player was found rocking under a cart, whispering. The fiddling never stops, like a man who'd stared into the abyss and found it doing a jig. By late July, the situation was impossible to ignore. The town council realized the stage experiment had escalated the problem, not solved it. The number of afflicted plateaued, but only because there were no more willing bodies left to join. People were either dancing, dead, or hiding in their cellars, clutching their own legs for dear life. And still, the music played on. To this day, historians remain divided on whether the musicians were sincere, coerced, or just really into freelance work. But they played day and night for dancers who couldn't stop, wouldn't stop, and definitely weren't enjoying themselves. It's one thing to lose control of your limbs. It's another thing entirely to have a live soundtrack. Strasbourg invented the first music festival where everyone left in worse shape than they arrived. Coachella could never. By now, the town square resembled the aftermath of a Renaissance music video directed by a demon with no sense of pacing. Strasbourg's well-meaning experiment in dance-it-out therapy was rapidly turning into a crisis, and not the fun kind, involving too much mead and a regrettable haircut. People were collapsing mid-step, seizing in the streets, and twitching in feverish heaps against timber walls. The dancers couldn't stop, and the musicians were too afraid or too well paid to stop playing. Which brings us to the next horrifying realization. The human body isn't built for this kind of marathon choreography. After days without rest, food, or hydration, remember? This was July, and Strasbourg was baking under a brutal heat wave. The dancers began to suffer the very real consequences of their unwilling cardio. Feet blistered and split open, ankles buckled, knees hyperextended with wet, audible crunches. Some dancers wore through their shoes. Others danced barefoot across stone and dirt until their toes looked like they'd been slow roasted. And because nothing says medieval drama quite like poor hygiene, a few reportedly got infections and open foot wounds while still dancing. Yet somehow, they danced on. Here's a true medical fact. The human body can burn between 300 to 600 calories an hour while dancing, depending on intensity. If you're doing that non-stop, for 12 to 24 hours a day, without rest or sustenance, you're in an extreme calorie deficit that can lead to rapid organ failure. Add the stress of constant motion and emotional distress, and you're looking at dehydration, rhabdomyolysis, a lovely condition where your muscles basically melt into your bloodstream, and heat stroke so severe it can fry neurons like bacon. That's where many of these dancers were headed. There were reports, grim ones, of people frothing at the mouth, groaning in agony while their feet still moved. A few collapsed with blood pouring from their noses or ears. And yes, some dropped dead mid-spin, often surrounded by others who didn't even stop to notice. What's especially unsettling is that despite all this, none of them wanted to be there. This wasn't euphoria. It wasn't rapture. It was a mechanical, unrelenting compulsion, like their muscles had disconnected from their minds. This leads us to the ongoing academic debate. What could drive otherwise healthy people into a state of fatal, involuntary motion, cited some mass trauma response, a cultural manifestation of stress, the physiological impact of starvation combined with psychosis? Some modern scholars argue it was a form of mass psychogenic illness, formerly known as mass hysteria, where psychological stress triggers physical symptoms across a population. The Middle Ages were, after all, a time when life expectancy hovered somewhere between maybe next harvest and oops. Rats. Add poverty, war, religious fanaticism, and no knowledge of the endocrine system. And the brain may have decided to pull the emergency lever labeled dance until you die. But even if it was psychosomatic, the physical toll was all too real. One chronicle describes a woman who danced until her legs gave out, then continued to roll side to side on the ground in a kind of grotesque shimmy. Another man reportedly dislocated his shoulder mid-leap, but continued hopping in place, screaming in time with the drumbeat. It's not clear whether these accounts are perfectly accurate or just medieval exaggerations, exaggeration being one of the era's most popular pastimes. But there are enough consistent descriptions across multiple sources to paint a nightmarish picture. Even the clergy started to panic. They couldn't explain it. Was it demonic possession? A divine test. Was God watching from above, wondering why no one was doing the worm properly? Desperate to understand the carnage, some physicians stepped in, men trained in the delicate arts of leeching, cupping, and speculative bleeding. One Strasbourg doctor reportedly declared, with great seriousness, that the problem lay in the hearts of the afflicted being overheated and moist. His recommendations was marontiu until the excess moisture evaporated. It's like prescribing more sun to someone already suffering sunstroke. And yet, the theory caught on. The heat of July, plus the crowded venues, plus the physical exertion, created a perfect storm of metabolic disaster. Dancers lost control of their bladders. Some vomited blood. A few died with their arms frozen in midair, locked into some cursed gesture of agony. But the music never stopped. Let's take a moment for a quirky but true off-topic detail. At roughly the same time this was happening. Over in Italy, doctors were prescribing powdered unicorn horn as a treatment for poisoning. Meanwhile, in England, there were actual laws against eating fish on non-fish days, punishable by fine or fasting. All of which is to say, the medieval wellness industry was running entirely on vibes. So maybe it's no surprise that Strasbourg, in the face of an exploding body count, kept doing what it always did, throwing theory after theory at the problem like very confused spaghetti. Was it spiritual, physical, demonic, mold-based? Spoiler. Next chapter. We'll talk about mold. But for now, we're left with this grim tableau, a town square slick with sweat and blood, the air thick with the scent of human exhaustion, music echoing against the timber walls, dozens of bodies in motion, some alive, some not. And at the center of it all, a desperate question that no one could answer. Why won't they stop? At some point, even the drummers were like, "Guys, this is starting to feel a little dark." At some point, somebody had to ask the obvious question, not why they were dancing, because at this point, that answer was somewhere between God's will and don't ask. You might start dancing too. No. The question was more practical. What were they eating? Because these people were clearly not okay. And if there was one thing the 16th century did know how to blame, it was bread, specifically moldy bread. Enter ergot. This is a real historical and scientific fact. Ergot is a parasitic fungus that grows on rye in damp conditions, and when consumed, it can cause convulsions, hallucinations, severe muscle spasms, and in high doses, death. Basically, it's LSD's evil older cousin, and it was unknowingly baked into everything from peasant loaves to communion wafers across medieval Europe. And the summer of 1518, absolutely perfect weather for a bumper crop of nightmare rye. Later historians, centuries after the dancers had hung up their bloody shoes, would point fingers at ergot as the likeliest culprit. The theory goes like this. A wet spring caused ergot to flourish on local rye crops. The townspeople, unknowingly ingesting tiny doses, began to experience tremors and hallucinations. Combine that with starvation, religious stress, and mass suggestion, and voila, spontaneous human rave. Ergot poisoning could explain the twitching, the lack of coordination, the fixed expressions, the feeling of being compelled to move, as if by invisible strings, even the deaths, since ergot can cause severe vasoconstriction that leads to gangrene or heart failure. It almost fits. But here's where the theory starts to boogie offbeat. If the bread was the culprit, why wasn't everyone affected? Why didn't bakers collapse? Why didn't the rich who also ate rye suffer the same fate? And most telling, why did the outbreak seem to spread by observation rather than ingestion? In other words, why did watching someone dance seem to make you dance, too? That's not something mold typically does. There's also the inconvenient fact that ergot poisoning tends to cause rigidity, not fluid motion. People afflicted usually seize, cramp, and curl inward, not spin in rhythmic arcs while crying softly to the sound of a hurdy-gurdy. This has led to an ongoing academic debate. Was ergot just one piece of the puzzle? A biological trigger that, combined with mass psychological stress, created the perfect storm for a bizarre outbreak. Or was it simply an attractive modern scapegoat? The kind of answer we like because it feels scientific, even when the facts dance away under scrutiny. Historians remain divided. Some defend the ergot theory with passion, citing other instances of Anthony's fire, the old-timey term for ergot poisoning, causing chaos in rural villages. Others dismiss it entirely. pointing to the very specific and social nature of the dancing. Because let's not forget, people weren't just spasming. They were often performing coordinated, if panicked, movements. Some danced in sync, others attempted to lead lines or mirror their neighbors. One man was seen trying to clap along with the musicians while also sobbing uncontrollably. Not exactly the behavior of someone having a seizure. Still, ergot remained the go-to theory for centuries. It was tidy, fungal, testable. The kind of answer that made sense if you didn't think too hard about human behavior. But if it wasn't the bread, then what was it? Time for a quirky but real off-topic detail while Strasbourg was dealing with its accidental dance festival. A nearby German town had issued a public ban on laughing. That's right. People were being fined for excessive chuckling in public places, believed to be a sign of demonic possession or moral decay. So across the Rhine, folks were forcibly stone-faced, while in Strasbourg, people were collapsing mid-twerk. Europe was a mood. Back to the mold. Local authorities didn't test the bread. They didn't burn the harvest or call in a fungal expert, partially, because no one was a fungal expert. They did what any sensible 16th century leaders would do. They assumed this was either divine punishment or the work of Saint Vitus, the patron saint of dance, drama, and probably nervous breakdowns. Still, the ergot theory wouldn't die, unlike many of the dancers. It kept popping up in history books, documentaries, and undergrad essays like a persistent rash. It was neat, explainable, and slightly terrifying. The idea that your daily bread could send you into a death waltz remains one of history's most unappetizing footnotes. But the truth, no moldy baguette can explain the sound of 400 people in full-blown crisis mode, trying to scream through dance. No fungus makes people drag their children to watch. No spore explains the tears, the guilt, the look of panic frozen on the faces of those who danced until their hearts gave out. If bread was to blame, it was only part of the recipe. A very weird, very tragic recipe. By late July, theories started to split. The city council, previously pro-drum circle, began to rethink their strategy. The clergy started digging up old texts about exorcisms and martyrdom, and the dancers, they were still dancing. In the middle of a sticky, crumbling Europe, as wars simmered and religions fractured, 400 people lost control of their bodies, and no one knew why. Ergot poisoning may have planted the seed, but something much stranger made it bloom. If bread made me dance, I'd have tap shoes by now. But this was something else. As the bodies piled up and the town ran out of fresh dancers, Strasbourg turned to a higher power specifically, the very saint believed to have caused the whole mess, introducing Saint Vitus, the patron saint of dancers, epileptics, comedians, and people having a really hard time emotionally processing 16th century life. If you've never heard of him, that's fair. Saint Vitus is one of those saints who seems to have picked up several job titles over the centuries, like a medieval resume made out of candles and mild trauma. He was an early Christian martyr, allegedly boiled alive in oil with a rooster, no explanation offered, and somehow wound up being blamed for seizures, nervous disorders, and dance plagues. A natural progression. By the summer of 1518, Strasbourg's clergy were convinced the town had angered Saint Vitus, not through sin exactly, but through neglect. People weren't praying hard enough, or the right way, or with the correct amount of foot-tapping reverence. And now, the saint had cursed them to literally dance themselves to death. This was, remarkably, considered a reasonable diagnosis at the time. The idea of Saint Vitus's dance wasn't new. Similar outbreaks had been reported across Europe as far back as the 1300s, groups of people seized by uncontrollable dancing, often linked to saints or divine punishment. In fact, by the time Frau Trophea started her sidewalk number, dancing mania was a known phenomenon, though no one understood it. The clergy's proposed solution appeased the saint. And so began one of the most tragically ironic pilgrimages in medieval history. Dancers were rounded up gently, at first, but with increasing force when necessary, and taken from the town square to a shrine to Saint Vitus, located in a forested mountain region near Saverne, about 30 miles away. Some went willingly, others had to be transported while dancing, which sounds ridiculous until you picture a cart full of flailing, sobbing people being hauled up a slope by confused horses. It's a historically confirmed detail that when the dancers arrived, priests gave them red shoes lined with holy oil and wool, which is either a bizarrely specific cure or an early attempt at therapeutic footwear branding. The idea was that the shoes would provide spiritual insulation, shielding their souls and maybe souls from further divine torment. They were also made to walk 3 times around the shrine and lie prostrate on the ground, while clerics performed ritual prayers to Saint Vitus. Some accounts say they screamed, others say they fell unconscious and didn't wake for hours. Miraculously, or perhaps just coincidentally, many of the afflicted did stop dancing after the ritual, or they stopped because their bodies had reached the final stage of total collapse. Either way, the shrine cure marked a turning point. Fewer new cases appeared. Musicians were finally sent home, possibly with PTSD. The town square was cleared of dancers and cleaned with a mixture of holy water and vinegar. Public prayers were held. And slowly, awkwardly, Strasbourg began to inch back toward normalcy, but the dancing plague had left its mark. There's an ongoing philosophical debate among historians: did the pilgrimage work? Because it addressed the actual cause, a kind of spiritual or psychosomatic rupture. Or did it work simply because the dancers believed it would? Was this mass psychosis finding its own catharsis? Some argue that the shrine visit functioned as a group ritual of release and emotional off-ramp for a town in crisis. Others think the power of communal suggestion, reinforced by religious intensity, provided just enough shock to jolt the afflicted out of their trance. Modern psychology might call this a behavioral extinction event. Medieval priests called it getting right with the saint. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: Strasbourg's obsession with Vitus went way up after the incident. Local churches commissioned stained glass tributes, small idols were carved, and in one case, a family reportedly built a chicken coop in the saint's honor, which historians believe may have been an inside joke referencing that unfortunate oil and rooster execution. Let's not forget a real off-topic detail here. Saint Vitus would later become the patron saint of actors. Yes, actors, which means by spiritual inheritance. He now watches over method performers who won't break character and community theater productions where no one memorizes their lines. Maybe this plague was just him workshopping some choreography. So the red shoes did their job whether by placebo or piety. Most of the surviving dancers returned to their homes and did not relapse. Some, according to local records, became deeply religious afterward. Others apparently moved away, perhaps to avoid becoming that guy who did jazz hands during a funeral. But the trauma remained. Even those who hadn't danced had watched dozens of neighbors, family members, even children, spiraling into exhaustion in full view. One boy reportedly refused to speak for weeks after watching his mother dance herself unconscious. Another man built a small altar in his home and burned rosemary daily, hoping to ward off a relapse. Strasbourg, it seemed, had developed a collective memory of rhythm-induced horror, and still, no one could answer the one question that echoed long after the last jig. Why did it happen? Was it the saint, the bread, the blood, the brain? Or was it simply a community so stressed, so brittle, so overheated by life, that one woman's twitch became everyone's reckoning? Of all the saints to make angry, Vitus was arguably the pettiest, but also the best choreographer. So now you've got a whole city traumatized, a pile of discarded red shoes, and a saint who may or may not be the spiritual equivalent of an overzealous dance coach. But here's the catch: Strasbourg in 1518 wasn't an outlier. It was just the most infamous example of something that had already happened multiple times across Europe and would happen again. Yes, the dancing plague had a tour schedule. Earlier outbreaks of so-called dancing mania had been recorded for centuries. In 1374, a massive event gripped Aachen, a German town west of Cologne, where hundreds of people danced in the streets for days. Reports said the afflicted screamed for help, saw visions of demons, and even leapt into rivers or flung themselves into graveyards to escape the compulsion. It spread from town to town, like a fever dream on horseback. Another happened in Metz, then in Trier, then in Liege, all within a few decades. What's strange is how eerily similar these outbreaks were, regardless of region. Same convulsions, same screaming, same dance until you collapse energy. The participants often came from poor or marginalized groups: farmers, craftsmen, women, beggars. They'd start twitching or hopping in public. Then others would follow. One eyewitness described a man who danced so violently, his ribs broke beneath his shirt. And this wasn't just a Catholic problem, either. Protestant areas, Jewish communities, even places with a strong folk pagan tradition were hit. The geography changed, but the choreography didn't. That has led to a long-standing academic debate. Was this a cultural meme before memes existed? Was Europe primed for dance hysteria, the same way modern society can catch psychological trends via TikTok? Or were these outbreaks truly spontaneous and neurological? Historians point to the shared ingredients in all these cases: widespread famine or economic collapse, extreme religious pressure or millenarian fear. Hello, looming apocalypse. Isolated, poorly educated communities without access to medical care or explanations. In short, the perfect ecosystem for trauma to go viral. And here's a true historical fact. Many of these outbreaks were linked to fears surrounding the end times. In 1374, during one of the biggest flare-ups, people genuinely believed the Last Judgment was imminent. So, naturally, when someone started dancing uncontrollably in the square, others assumed it was either a divine ecstasy, B, punishment for sin, or C, the opening act for the Four Horsemen. Add in a thick overlay of plague trauma, because yes, this was still Black Death-era Europe, and you have a population with no understanding of mental health, watching their neighbors pirouette toward death, and thinking, yep, checks out. There are also records of professional dancers being brought in to calm the afflicted with soothing rhythms. That's right, medieval dance therapists were a thing. They didn't work, obviously, but they tried their best with the available choreography. And just to inject some off-topic absurdity during one outbreak, an Italian town believed the dancers had been bitten by a mythical spider called a tarantula, and the only cure was to perform a frantic dance called the tarantella until the poison left the body. This led to an entire music genre designed to make people sweat out imaginary spider venom. So if you've ever clapped along to a folk tune in southern Italy, you may have been participating in a centuries-old arachnophobia exorcism. Fun. All these outbreaks followed similar patterns. And yet, only Strasbourg had the full-blown civic response: the stage, the musicians, the red shoes. Maybe that's why it became the most notorious. But the ripple effect was clear. Towns across the region grew wary. Dancing in public was eyed with suspicion. Religious processions avoided rhythmic chanting. Some places banned drumming entirely. Because what if it started again? Here's where the philosophical part kicks in. Scholars ask, were these outbreaks really about dancing? Or were they just the most visible symptom of something deeper? Think about it, most of Europe at this time believed in demons, saints, and celestial punishment. Guilt wasn't just personal, it was civic. If your town was hit by plague, crop failure, or a hailstorm that flattened your cow, people assumed someone had sinned. And if people started dancing uncontrollably, well, clearly the sin had reached a full-blown crescendo. But what if these dancers were expressing something too terrifying to say aloud? that they were overwhelmed, afraid, hopeless, that life had become so unbearable, so tightly wound with religious dread. They needed their bodies to scream for them. It wasn't a performance. It was a breakdown set to drums, and still, even centuries later, no one knows for sure. Every outbreak added to the mystery. Every dancer became another unsolved footnote. The clergy kept praying. Physicians kept bleeding. The dancers kept spinning, and all of Europe waited to see who would break next. Imagine living in a time when the world felt so cursed. Your body staged its own protest in the form of a full-body, unskippable interpretive dance. By now, Strasbourg had calmed down, if you can call mildly less possessed calm. The last of the dancers had been hauled off to the shrine of Saint Vitus. The musicians had fled the scene like Renaissance jazz survivors, and the town's public square once again smelled of sausages instead of sweat and fear. But the mystery had only deepened. That's when the physicians showed up. Not just local barber surgeons with bloodletting kits and pocket frogs, though those guys were always around, sharpening things and dramatically misdiagnosing people. No, these were the big boys. Scholars, medical minds from nearby cities, summoned by the Strasbourg City Council in a last-ditch attempt to make sense of the madness. And their consensus, hot blood. Once again, Europe's favorite explanation for literally everything made its return. Headaches, hot blood, impure thoughts, hot blood, dancing until your internal organs throw up the white flag. Yep, that'll be hot blood too. Here's a true historical fact. Most 16th century medicine was still based on the ancient Greco-Roman theory of humorism, the belief that the body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile that needed to be balanced. Every ailment, from sniffles to spontaneous death cha-chas, was diagnosed by figuring out which humor had gotten uppity. Dancing mania, clearly a case of excessive sanguine temperament. The prescribed cure, bleeding the patient, cold baths, avoiding spicy foods, and because of course more dancing, to burn off the remaining heat. It's like trying to put out a fire with a flamethrower. Physicians examined the survivors, poked at them, muttered about moist liver conditions, and confidently explained that the only way to restore harmony was to let the body resolve itself through motion. One prominent doctor recommended vigorous twirling in the presence of clergy. Another advocated throwing dancers into icy rivers to shock the blood into obedience. These were actual published opinions, in Latin, no less. But even as they delivered their very serious diagnoses, these doctors were deeply unsettled, because something about the plague didn't add up. The outbreak had spread visually. It jumped from person to person, not through bread, not through germs, but seemingly through observation. People saw someone else dancing, and then, suddenly, they couldn't stop themselves. That wasn't a medical symptom. That was psychological mimicry or, as one modern psychologist called it, behavioral contagion on LSD. And this is where we enter the realm of mass psychogenic illness, or MPI. It's a real psychological phenomenon that still occurs today. Symptoms spread through suggestion and shared stress, usually in tight-knit communities, often among young people or isolated groups. There's no underlying pathogen, just the human brain, trying to offload unbearable pressure in the weirdest way possible. An MPI has range. In 1962, in Tanganyika, modern-day Tanzania, a schoolgirl laughed uncontrollably during class, and soon, so did her classmates. For weeks. The laughter epidemic forced multiple schools to close. No one could explain it. In the early 2000s, an outbreak of fainting spells and convulsions swept through schools in Afghanistan, often among teenage girls. The cause, no toxins, no viruses, just stress, fear, and the extraordinary suggestibility of the human brain. So when modern neurologists and psychologists look back at Strasbourg, their diagnosis is clear mass psychogenic illness amplified by religious belief, social isolation, and environmental trauma. It wasn't the bread. It wasn't Saint Vitus. It wasn't some demonic dance controller playing Dance Dance Inquisition. It was chronic stress with a beat. And here's where the philosophical debate comes in. Is MPI real suffering? The symptoms are very real: sweating, seizures, even death. But there's no physical cause. So, do we treat it like a disease? A societal failure, a misunderstood cry for help. Some psychologists argue MPI is the ultimate form of repressed emotion. The body taking over because the mind's been told it's not allowed to scream. In 1518, there were no therapists, no safe spaces, just saints, shame, and seasonal bread poisoning. So when a person broke under the weight of it all, they broke loudly, and others, desperate for release, followed. Also, and this cannot be overstated, life was absolutely brutal. Imagine you're a peasant in 1518. You've survived the Black Death, but your parents didn't. You farm in a field owned by a man who taxes you in chickens. Your kids have worms. The priest says you're going to hell for thinking about bread too lustfully. And now, suddenly, someone in your neighborhood is doing the medieval equivalent of the worm in the street and won't stop. Of course you're going to snap. One of the most haunting accounts comes from a young woman who, after surviving the ordeal, reportedly lived in silence for the rest of her life. Not because of trauma from dancing, but because she remembered feeling relieved while dancing. Free. Out of her mind. Out of her responsibilities. And that, she believed, meant she was unholy. The doctors never saw her again. Let's not forget a quirky detail. Some of the physicians brought along early stethoscopes, basically hollow tubes they jammed into people's chests to listen for sadness in the heart. One report actually refers to a man whose heart made the sound of a trapped goat. He died 2 days later. Cause of death? Probably goat-related. In the end, the physicians left Strasbourg with more questions than answers. They published treatises, gave lectures, argued in scholarly Latin, and quietly made a note to never come back to Alsace in July. Because if it wasn't mold, and it wasn't the saint, it had to be them, the people, their minds, their bodies, their unbearable need to break from a world that didn't allow it. When your medical plan is just spin it out of your system, it might be time for a second opinion, or at least a different band. You'd think that after dozens of deaths, a citywide trauma spiral, and a surprise saint-themed dance pilgrimage, the authorities of Strasbourg would pump the brakes on public boogieing. You'd be wrong. In the weeks following the final dancer's collapse, the city's leaders gathered to reflect, and by reflect, we mean they panicked quietly while pretending everything was fine. Because despite the musical exorcisms, shrine visits, and riverside rebaptisms, the underlying issue hadn't been solved. The townspeople were still scared, tense, watching each other like hawks with side eyes. And here's the twist. Rather than blaming themselves or asking difficult questions, like, should we maybe provide resources for mental health, a concept 300 years from existing? The powers that be decided. The solution was simple: keep the dancing going, but in a controlled way. Thus began one of the most hilariously misguided public health initiatives in European history. Strasbourg created government-approved dance zones. Yes, they literally roped off areas where citizens could dance safely, under supervision, so as to avoid another unregulated outbreak. It was the Renaissance version of designated scream spaces, except with more violins and fewer understanding therapists. The council brought in authorized musicians to provide uplifting rhythms, not too fast lest anyone get inspired again, but not too sad either, because that might remind people of the plague and send them spiraling. They also hired town dancers. Yes, actual professionals to demonstrate acceptable choreography. The goal: provide an emotional outlet for the community, without triggering another psychogenic disaster. It did not go well, because now, every twitchy shoulder or overly enthusiastic hop was seen as a possible relapse. People were terrified of looking too rhythmic. One unfortunate blacksmith reportedly sneezed while adjusting his foot, and was immediately dragged off by 4 men, convinced he was about to erupt into full-body interpretive hysteria. The stigma grew. Dancing became suspicious. Weddings went quiet. Street musicians were banned from playing anything with a beat. One tavern was fined for allowing overexcited clapping. And still, the memory of the plague lingered. Here's a true historical fact after the 1518 outbreak. Records show a notable drop in public festivals and musical celebrations in Strasbourg. Many were outright cancelled, others were toned down. A city once famous for its bustling markets and raucous processions now tiptoed through silence, afraid that one tambourine too many could reopen the wound. It's the long shadow of trauma, and it's incredibly modern. What happened in Strasbourg mimics the pattern of communities recovering from mass panic events. In contemporary terms, it's what psychologists call behavioral overcorrection, when a society responds to collective chaos by tightening the screws on everything, often in absurd ways. Just like post-crisis communities today might ban books, enforce curfews, or cancel entire genres of music shout-out to the 1990s satanic panic. Strasbourg became obsessed with controlling movement. They even issued guidelines on how to walk through public spaces without unintended rhythmic expression. These were not legally binding, but were posted in churches and guild halls, urging citizens to avoid swaying while speaking and refrain from tapping one's toes during reflection. You can't make this up. You don't have to. Meanwhile, the townspeople themselves were coping. Some built home altars to Sancta Vitus and prayed nightly not to dream of music. Others wore charms around their ankles, iron bells designed to ward off spontaneous rhythm. A few took to sleeping in basements, where the silence was oppressive, but at least no one could see if your foot twitched in your sleep. There were even reports, real ones, of people purposely injuring their feet so they'd have an excuse not to dance, should the madness return. One merchant dropped a hammer on his toes. A teenage girl reportedly broke her own ankle with a brick. Better limping than leaping, apparently. The atmosphere was what you'd expect from a city recovering from a musical exorcism: tense, paranoid, and vaguely sweaty. And here's a quirky, off-topic, but 100% real detail during this same year. A nearby village held a trial for a cow accused of winking at a bishop. That cow was found guilty of witchcraft and executed. Just in case you were wondering where the logical priorities were at the time. Back to Strasbourg, despite the fear. People needed music. They craved release. The human body doesn't just shut off emotion because it's scared. So underground gatherings began to spring up quiet. Candle-lit rooms where trusted neighbors would hum together, or play soft string instruments, or dance in slow, almost meditative motion. These became known, unofficially, as ghost circles, small social rituals where people tried to reclaim joy without tempting fate. They didn't publicize them, didn't advertise, but word spread, as it always does, and, slowly, quietly, music returned to the city, not in parades, not in parties, but in whispers. The city council, to their credit, backed off. The authorized dance zones faded into awkward memory. The fines for clapping were quietly withdrawn. Life resumed, changed, but intact. Still, no one forgot. There's an ongoing philosophical debate about what this overreaction tells us. Was Strasbourg just being cautious? Were they trying to protect their citizens? Or was this a textbook case of fear, creating the very thing it tried to prevent? One psychologist argued that by building a stage, they legitimized the dancing. By banning music, they deified it. And by trying to control every toe tap and sway, they taught people that joy was dangerous. Another view Strasbourg had no tools, no therapy, no psychiatry, no trauma-informed care. They did the best they could with rosaries, folk medicine, and a sincere hope that holy shoes could stop the beat. Either way, the ghost of 1518 danced on in memories, in nightmares, and in every awkward twitch that made a neighbor squint suspiciously across the market square. When you have to publicly announce that clapping is not allowed, it might be time to ask yourself if the rhythm's really gonna get you, or if you just need a hug. The doctors had left. The shrine had done its job, and the city council had finally stopped making dance-themed public policy, but the question still buzzed in Strasbourg like a tambourine that wouldn't shut up. What just happened? Because the math wasn't mathing. Hundreds of people dancing to death, dozens more traumatized. Entire streets turned into medieval mosh pits. None of it made sense. And the more people tried to explain it, the more the truth pirouetted out of reach. So naturally, the citizens of Strasbourg did what all deeply confused and mildly traumatized people do. After a crisis, they pretended it didn't happen. Within a few months, the official records went silent. No more reports, no town proclamations, not even a woodcut. It was as if the entire city had collectively deleted the incident from their mental inbox. But that didn't stop outsiders from noticing. Pilgrims, clerics, traveling scholars, even amateur chroniclers from nearby towns started writing down what they'd heard, usually third-hand, heavily embellished, and featuring just a bit too much dramatic flair. One popular version claimed the dancers were cursed for mocking a saint. Another suggested the plague was caused by moonlight on impure souls. One particularly spicy account involved a traveling minstrel who claimed his music had started the plague, because it was too good. He then used this as a marketing strategy and was reportedly run out of town with a tomato. Some of these stories were based in truth. Others were pure myth-making. But they all shared one thing: they didn't understand what had happened either. Which is exactly when the philosophers stepped in. If doctors couldn't explain it, and priests had only a vague suspicion about sinning knees, maybe reason could help. And so, Strasbourg's most educated minds gathered in candlelit rooms and began drafting hypotheses. They proposed atmospheric imbalances, bad astrology, musical parasites, curses triggered by improper chanting, and, in one bold scroll, demonic rhythm disruptions caused by inverted Gregorian scales. Most of these theories, while impressively worded, were unhelpful. One monk claimed the dancers were possessed by a joy demon that fed on guilt. Another scholar argued that the outbreak was proof that music itself was dangerous and should be banned altogether. He also suggested wind instruments were morally suspicious, which, honestly, is fair. Here's a true historical fact: in the centuries after the plague, music did become a theological battleground. Church authorities debated which instruments were godly and which ones encouraged sin. The organ passed. The lute was suspicious. The tambourine was deemed outright scandalous in at least 3 religious texts. So the dancing plague left more than just physical scars. It changed the culture's relationship with music, emotion, and the body. And while Strasbourg tried to bury the incident under layers of denial, artists remembered. A generation later, paintings began to appear dark, moody depictions of writhing crowds, wide-eyed dancers, and saints looking slightly uncomfortable. These were never labeled Strasbourg. 1518, but the parallels were too obvious to ignore. One especially famous engraving, Dance of Death, shows a skeletal figure playing the fiddle, while people of all classes, nobles, monks, peasants are forced to join in. It's not subtle, because even if no one wanted to talk about it, the image of people dancing themselves to death stuck around. It crept into folklore, into sermons, into bedtime stories told by parents who probably added, "And that's why you never skip confession." Here's a quirky off-topic detail that somehow fits around this same time. Rumors circulated in northern Germany of a screaming forest where trees made violin noises in the wind. Locals refused to enter it after dark, fearing it would make them dance. The forest, as far as we know, was just breezy and full of nervous squirrels, but it became part of the same ambient mythology. Back in Strasbourg, life continued. People still farmed, still traded, still baked suspiciously dry bread. But every now and then, someone would hear a rhythm and hesitate. A mother might pull her child away from a particularly catchy street song. A shopkeeper might glare at a customer who tapped their foot too aggressively while waiting for change. And somewhere, buried deep beneath the public square, was the unspoken knowledge that this city had once lost its mind in time with a drumbeat. And it could happen again. That's what makes the dancing plague so uniquely haunting. Not just because it happened, but because it could return, under the right stress, the right fear, the right ambient flute solo. That's also what makes it such fertile ground for debate. Modern scholars still argue about what really happened. Was it ergot poisoning? Like we've explored before, doubtful hallucinations. Yes, but not rhythmic group choreography. Was it mass psychogenic illness? Strong candidate, especially given the social conditions, religious oppression, and starvation. Was it a form of protest? Possibly. Some believe the dancers weren't simply broken. They were resisting, using their bodies to express what their mouths were not allowed to say. We are suffering. And you are not listening. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Something no one has figured out. A strange feedback loop of stress and superstition, of movement and meaning, that spiraled into one of the most surreal chapters in European history. There's no shortage of theories, just a shortage of answers. In a world where memory fades faster than facts, sometimes the body remembers what the brain is desperate to forget. Because, by now, you might be thinking, sure, this is weird, but we're not in the 1500s anymore. Surely our brains are better behaved now. Ah, sweet summer child. The truth is, the dancing never stopped. It just changed costumes. If you peel back the dusty layers of 1518 and look through a modern lens, what happened in Strasbourg starts to resemble something we still see: collective psychological events that spiral out of control. Cases where the human mind, under stress, short-circuits in the most theatrical way possible. Let's start with a true and recent example. In 2006, in Portugal, dozens of students at a high school reported mysterious rashes, dizziness, and difficulty breathing. The cause? A soap opera. No. Really. A storyline on the show Strawberries with Sugar, a very serious title, featured a virus that spread through a school, and within days, real students began reporting identical symptoms. No biological agent was ever found. The final diagnosis: mass psychogenic illness, triggered by a narrative. Now tell me that's not just a more digital version of Frau Trofea's sidewalk samba. In South Korea, there's a recurring issue of fainting spells at K-pop concerts, especially when certain high-energy groups perform. Doctors there have acknowledged a mix of sensory overload, emotional intensity, and suggestibility. No toxins, no biological infections. Just collective physiological drama. Back to Strasbourg if it happened once. It could happen again. That's the uncomfortable truth lurking beneath the tap shoes of history. Which brings us to the central philosophical tension. Are we ever really in control of our minds? Or are we just one shared trauma away from busting a move we can't turn off? Psychologists argue that group identity and mirror neurons, those little empathy circuits in your brain, play a huge role in this. When you see someone cry, you might tear up. When you see someone yawn, you yawn too. And when you see someone panic, your nervous system often chimes in with, "Should I be panicking too?" Cool. Cool. Let's all panic together. Now imagine that feedback loop happening in a population with no emotional regulation, no therapy, no access to information beyond sermons and screaming. That's not just a dance plague waiting to happen. It's a spiritual pressure cooker with a tambourine problem. And it's not limited to the past. In 2012, a group of teenage girls in Leroy, New York, began experiencing uncontrollable tics, tremors, and stuttering. The symptoms looked neurological, but tests showed nothing. The final verdict: mass psychogenic illness. Most of the girls recovered once media coverage and community tension died down. But guess what made it spread YouTube? One girl posted a video. Another saw it. Her symptoms worsened. Another joined in. And so on. So maybe the real dancing plague of today doesn't happen in town squares. It happens in comment sections, viral videos, group chats. Maybe the rhythm isn't musical anymore. It's emotional. Anxiety shared and reshared. One body twitching online becomes 1,000 more. Like retweet, collapse. Even some online challenge trends can border on collective compulsion. The cinnamon challenge, the Tide Pod incident, that thing where teens pretended to faint on purpose in locker rooms, all of them walk a thin line between performance and possession. It's not that different from 1518. We're still scared, still overwhelmed, still looking for a release that our bodies can carry when our minds can't. And sometimes, that release comes in the form of movement, intentional or not. Let's not forget a quirky modern detail a few years ago. A startup in California tried to create empathy gyms where people would sob together in a dark room while ambient music played. It failed. But for a moment, they almost monetized what Strasbourg accidentally invented: a group catharsis session disguised as an emotional meltdown. Of course, not all modern scholars agree. Some historians say drawing parallels between medieval dance plagues and internet panic cheapens the original experience. They argue the 1518 event was rooted in specific cultural beliefs, especially around sin and sainthood. It wasn't just stress, it was spiritual choreography. The people believed they were meant to suffer this way. Others say that belief is the point, that it doesn't matter whether the cause is bread mold, a TikTok trend, or religious guilt. What matters is the shared perception of danger. Once enough people believe something is happening, it becomes real. The symptoms appear. The body follows. The spiral begins. You can see why the debate never ends, because it touches something raw, something uncomfortable. The idea that your body might betray you, that your mind might latch onto someone else's crisis and say, yes, that. I'll have what she's having. And before you know it, you're not observing the panic. You are the panic. That's what makes the dancing plague of 1518 so much more than a historical curiosity. It's a mirror, a really sweaty, confusing, rhythmically possessed mirror. And the next time you feel that weird collective energy at a concert, in a protest, during a blackout, in the middle of a trending hashtag, maybe, just maybe, you'll remember Frau Trophea, her bloody feet, her haunted face, and you'll wonder how close we still are to dancing ourselves into oblivion. The human brain is powerful, fragile, and occasionally choreographed. Never underestimate its flair for drama. By now, the bodies had been buried, the shoes discarded, the fiddles silenced. But in the years following the dancing plague, one question continued to haunt the region like the world's creepiest after-party. Why Strasbourg? Out of all the towns in Europe, each filled to the brim with stress, sin, and suspiciously twitchy peasants, why did this modest Alsatian city become the epicenter of what remains one of history's most spectacular public breakdowns? Let's take a closer look at the vibe of Strasbourg, circa 1518. First, the city was bursting at the seams with contradiction. It was prosperous but teetering, educated but deeply superstitious, cosmopolitan but governed by theocratic rigidity. The Holy Roman Empire's influence was strong here, which meant religion wasn't just a private matter, it was civic infrastructure. Every thunderstorm was a potential warning from God. Every harvest failure was a potential punishment. And in the years leading up to the plague, things weren't exactly chill. A recent flood had destroyed crops. Inflation was spiraling. Food shortages hit hardest among laborers and farmers. Meanwhile, the rich were surprised, doing just fine. Their banquet tables stacked with pork and honey, while their serfs chewed on boiled weeds. Here's a true historical fact in the 1510s. Strasbourg had enacted harsh sumptuary laws rules that controlled how people could dress and behave based on their social class. For example, if you were a shoemaker, you couldn't wear a belt with gold thread. If you were a merchant's wife, you were fined for wearing silk unless you'd birthed at least 3 legitimate children and could recite the Nicene Creed in Latin backwards. Okay, that last part's probably apocryphal, but you get the idea. These laws didn't just limit fashion. They reinforced the brutal class divide, making sure that anyone struggling felt seen, but in the worst, most humiliating way possible. Now add to this a layer of apocalyptic fear. It was the early 16th century, and whispers of the coming end times were spreading like wildfire. Strange weather patterns, unusual stars, animals born with extra legs. Every hiccup of nature was interpreted as a cosmic red flag. And in Strasbourg, fire and brimstone preachers leaned hard into it, warning that Judgment Day was nigh and that only the truly penitent would be spared. It wasn't just theology, it was fear management. People lived under the weight of invisible moral debt. One wrong word, one skipped confession, one lustful thought, and boom, eternal damnation. The guilt was constant, internalized, and very, very sweaty. Which brings us to one of the most compelling modern theories. The dancing plague wasn't about joy, it was about guilt. Some historians argue that the dancers weren't overcome with ecstasy. They weren't even necessarily in pain. They were being purged. They believed, whether consciously or not, that they deserved this. There's a Latin phrase from the era, scrawled in the margins of one monk's journal, peccata saltabo. I dance my sins away. That's not just a metaphor. That's theology with choreography. In this view, Strasbourg wasn't just a city in crisis. It was a spiritual powder keg. And Frau Trophäa, she struck the match, which leads to an ongoing philosophical debate among scholars of medieval culture. Was dancing seen as sinful or redemptive? On the one hand, religious authorities constantly warned against body temptation. The flesh was weak. The hips were weaker. Uncontrolled movement was associated with lust, pride, and witchcraft. You didn't bust a move, you invited the devil to waltz through your soul. On the other hand, saints like Vitus were believed to heal through ecstatic motion. Some monasteries even had rituals where monks spun slowly in prayer, like meditative Beyblades, seeking divine communion. So which was it, damnable or curative? The answer, like most medieval contradictions, was yes. It depended on context, on class, and let's be honest on how sweaty you looked doing it. That's why Strasbourg became the stage. It had the guilt, the stress, the social pressure, the eschatological dread. It had rigid moral codes and zero psychological infrastructure. It had people desperate for meaning and a leadership structure that confused piety with micromanagement. And then, like a lightning strike, one person's personal crisis became collective performance art. A quirky detail to drive this home in the months following the plague. Several artists in the region began depicting saints with unusually contorted poses, arms raised, legs twisted mid-step, as if they were mid-breakdown. These images weren't joyful, they were solemn, and people prayed to them for relief from movement. Imagine that a holy image designed not to make you dance, but to make you stop. So Strasbourg didn't just host the dancing plague, it earned it. Through repression, through overregulation, through constant reminders that joy was dangerous and guilt was currency. In a sense, the city's nervous system had no choice. When the dam finally cracked, it didn't leak, it river danced. If you trap a whole society in guilt and fear long enough, don't be surprised when the first nervous breakdown turns into a flash mob. The last dancer had collapsed. The shrine had been blessed. The red shoes were hung up for good or possibly burned. But the memory of 1518 didn't just fade into the stained glass background of medieval life. It lingered, not in the form of statues or statuesque apologies, not even in song, oddly enough. Instead, the dancing plague of Strasbourg survived as a low-level ghost, a whisper, a caution, a story parents told their kids when they tapped their toes too enthusiastically at Mass. But here's the twist: Strasbourg wasn't alone. That's right. The 1518 outbreak was just one stop on a disturbingly recurring tour of dance hysteria. Multiple cases, some better documented than others, had erupted throughout Europe in the preceding centuries. And after Strasbourg, similar tremors continued to flicker across the continent like a twitchy, rhythmic shadow. Let's rewind the record and hit play on some of the lesser-known encores. One of the earliest known events occurred in Aachen. 1374, a bustling German city that, for reasons no one fully understood, found itself overcome with hundreds of people twitching, hopping, flailing, and eventually collapsing in convulsive heaps. They weren't celebrating. They weren't trained dancers. They were, according to chroniclers, gripped by a compulsion to move without rest, as if chased by invisible spirits. Some clutched their heads. Others screamed about devils grabbing their feet. Some claimed to see visioned saints, demons, blood-red skies. Many danced into exhaustion. Some drowned, hurling themselves into the river when they couldn't stop moving. And just like in Strasbourg, the outbreak spread from Aachen to Cologne to Flanders and beyond. It was like the world's least fun conga line. Fast forward to the 15th century, similar outbreaks occurred in northern Italy, Belgium, and even parts of Switzerland. Some were small 20 or 30 people collapsing in a market square. Others were larger, enough to warrant ecclesiastical inquiry and early attempts at epidemiological documentation, or at least a lot of confused finger-pointing. It's important to note that these weren't all identical to Strasbourg's plague. Some involved laughter, some convulsions. Others were more like episodes of frenzied leaping or frantically pacing in circles. But the shared features are hard to ignore. Sudden onset, uncontrollable movement, contagious behavior, absence of physical cause, extreme public fear, and, most crucially, a religious or spiritual interpretation of the event, which leads us to the Tarantism phenomenon of southern Italy. This one takes the concept of dancing for survival and cranks it up to 11. According to folk belief, particularly around the region of Apulia, being bitten by a tarantula, likely the wolf spider, Lycosa tarantula could cause a hysterical condition known as tarantism. Symptoms included lethargy, melancholia, hysteria, and an overwhelming need to dance to very specific music to be cured. And yes, this was taken extremely seriously. Victims would be brought to a designated spot, surrounded by musicians playing a fast, repetitive style of music. The afflicted would spin, twist, flail, cry, and dance sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. Sometimes, several people would join in, claiming they had been bitten too, though no one could ever seem to find the spider. Sound familiar? This treatment became a whole genre. The tarantella, as it came to be known, evolved from spider exorcism soundtrack to legitimate folk music tradition, and it's still performed today, albeit in slightly less panic-inducing contexts. So what's going on here? Were these real spider bites? Probably not. Were they real symptoms? Yes. Which is where modern psychology again raises its hand and says, mass psychogenic illness strikes again. In each of these outbreaks, from Aachen to Apulia to Strasbourg, the patterns hold. Socially stressed communities, a belief in divine or natural punishment, an accessible script for how to express distress as a flailing to a beat, and most importantly, no better outlet for emotional collapse. These people didn't need exorcisms. They needed safe ways to scream, but that wasn't an option, so their nervous systems chose dance. There's an ongoing academic debate over whether these events were entirely psychogenic or partially performative, meaning did people sometimes fake it to fit in, to avoid suspicion, to join the communal ritual. Some historians argue that in tight-knit communities, social pressure could make people catch symptoms they didn't really feel. Others suggest it wasn't about faking at all. It was about mirroring. If everyone around you is convulsing in grief, and you feel the same pain, but don't know how to express it, your body might just go ahead and join the performance. That's not imitation, that's survival. And for what it's worth, the church bought it. In case after case, religious authorities responded not with skepticism, but with shrines, rituals, and in some cases, approved dance ceremonies. The idea wasn't to stop the dancing, it was to control it, give it a direction, a meaning, a stage. Which brings us to a quirky, delightful, and real historical fact in some towns. Dancing became a preventative ritual. People would gather annually on certain saints' days to dance just a little, a sort of divine appeasement. Here's your dance, Saint Vitus. Please don't send the full plague again. Imagine a city with a municipal policy of low stakes boogieing to ward off spiritual disaster. And honestly, that's kind of beautiful. But it's also a warning, because every single one of these events, no matter how whimsical in hindsight, was born from something deeply broken, a world where no one could cry out. So instead, they spun in circles until they dropped. We look at these outbreaks and ask, how could this happen? But maybe the real question is, what stopped it from happening more often? By the time the 17th century rolled around, Europe had largely stopped dancing out of fear. The outbreaks of involuntary movement had faded, the tarantellas were repurposed for weddings, and Strasbourg quietly tried to reposition itself as a city that specialized in Gutenberg printing and not, soul-crushing public breakdowns. But the story wouldn't die, because even though the dancers were gone, the mystery never left. It remained like an echo, quiet but persistent, like a cough in the back pew during Mass, or a creaky floorboard in a silent room, or the feeling you get when someone taps their foot a little too often, and you wonder if history is about to repeat itself. The dancing plague had become something bigger than its original tragedy. It had become legend, not a fun one, necessarily, but one that flickered in and out of cultural consciousness, always slightly unbelievable, always just strange enough to question. By the 18th century, early Enlightenment thinkers began poking at it from a safe historical distance. These were the first people to really try and categorize it, not as a divine punishment or moral failing, but as a medical and social anomaly. A French physician named Jean-Martin Charcot wrote about dancing mania in the 1800s, comparing it to forms of hysteria he had observed in patients, particularly women, whom he believed, in his very problematic French way, were more emotionally porous. Later still, German neurologists began to retroactively classify the event as a neurological epidemic, while early psychologists got very excited about the whole mass suggestion angle. Suddenly, Frau Trophea was no longer a warning, she was a case study. Modern textbooks still reference her. Some cite the Strasbourg outbreak in chapters on conversion disorder. Others include it under discussions of mass hysteria, psychogenic illness, and culturally bound syndromes. And yet, even now, no one agrees on a single cause. Every explanation comes with a footnote, every theory with a but. If it was ergot poisoning, why didn't it affect everyone who ate the same bread? If it was religious mania, why did it only happen in certain cities? Not everywhere religious fear existed. If it was psychological, why did it manifest so violently, so consistently, and why? Dancing. That last question has led to an ongoing philosophical debate that still appears in academic journals. Why did the human body, when overloaded with fear and suffering, choose dance as its outlet? Why not screaming? Why not catatonia? Why not wandering into the forest and yelling at a tree? Some suggest dance, being rhythmic, is self-reinforcing. Once you start moving, the movement creates its own internal loop. It overrides conscious thought, triggers endorphins, makes the body forget it's tired until it crashes. Others argue that dance is communal. It spreads easily. It invites participation. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. especially if you're desperate for release and don't know what that even looks like anymore. Or maybe, and this is the unsettling one, maybe dance is the most primal way we know how to say, "Help me." Before language, before medicine, before diagnoses and therapy and hashtags, maybe the body's first instinct under pressure was to move, to tremble, to thrash, to externalize what it couldn't explain. And if that's true, then Strasbourg wasn't a medical mystery. It was a chorus of bodies trying to speak in the only way they could. There's a true and very modern example to support this theory. In 2018, a psychologist studying refugee populations in Greece found that several children exhibited non-epileptic seizures after experiencing extreme trauma. No underlying disease, no toxins, just the brain short-circuiting under pressure. In many cases, the only treatment that helped was movement therapy-guided physical expression, often resembling dance. Strasbourg was ahead of the curve. It just didn't know how to end the routine. That's part of what makes the story so uniquely tragic. It wasn't just about what happened. It was about the absence of any space to process what happened. No language, no structure, no safety net. So the pressure built, and when it couldn't stay inside, it exploded outward in sync, in public, in rhythm. The people of Strasbourg didn't dance because they wanted to. They danced because they had no other way to scream. And it worked. Not well, not cleanly, but it worked. Because after the dancing stopped, after the red shoes and the pilgrimages and the sanctioned drum circles faded into memory, something changed. The city was different. Quietly. Yes. But fundamentally, weddings became softer, sermons less harsh, guilds stopped enforcing the no tambourine clauses, and music slowly returned not through fear, but through joy. It was as if the plague had exorcised something from the city itself. Not a demon, but a silence. And as centuries passed, that memory shifted from horror to curiosity, from curiosity to folklore, from folklore to, bedtime story, one that, to this day, refuses to sit still. Of all the things history tries to bury, nothing rises faster than a rhythm you tried to forget. There's a strange quiet to stories like this right at the end, when the dust has settled and the band has packed up, and all that's left is the lingering echo of footsteps that never really made sense. But they happened. The feet moved. The people danced. And no one not then, not now, could fully explain why. By the modern calendar, over 500 years have passed since Frau Trophäa stepped out of her house and into history with a single, fateful, offbeat shuffle. The world has changed since then. The cobblestone streets of Strasbourg now carry tourists, not trances. The shrines are mostly silent. The old timber homes have been remodeled with plumbing and Wi-Fi, but beneath it all, in the city's bones, the story still hums. Sometimes it's told in classrooms, sometimes it's told online, in articles that can't believe it's real. Sometimes it's whispered in late-night podcasts or dramatized with too much eerie background music. But the tale always returns. A woman danced, and no one could stop her. Others joined, and no one knew why. People died, and no one could explain it. A whole town lost itself, just long enough for the world to notice and then moved on like it hadn't. That's what's eerie. Not that it happened, but that it stopped. And the next day, the butchers opened shop, and the priests gave mass, and the bakers returned to their ovens. No memorial was built, no commemorative plaque, no statue of the woman who started it all. The history books moved on. The neighbors forgot. But the rhythm stayed locked somewhere deep in the collective subconscious, like a dream you mostly forget until someone taps a drum in just the wrong way. Because let's be honest, the idea of a dance plague sounds like something your imagination made up at 3 a.m. But it didn't. It was real, documented, witnessed, survived. It lived in the bodies of the people who twitched their way into legend, and it continues to live in the questions we still don't have answers for. Was it mold, maybe? A saint's curse? Possibly. A mass psychological reckoning with the weight of guilt, hunger, and despair. Almost certainly. But most of all, it was human. It was fear. It was sorrow. It was the unbearable need to do something with the feelings no one was allowed to say out loud. And so, they danced, until they couldn't. And maybe that's why this story endures, not because it was sensational, but because it was recognizable. It speaks to something ancient, something still buried inside us. That, under just the right pressure, in just the wrong moment, maybe we too would reach our limit and move. Let's close our eyes for a moment and imagine it. The cobbled square, empty now. The warm haze of summer fading into dusk. Somewhere, a memory drifts uninvited, but not quite unwelcome. And in the silence, beneath the noise of the world, you almost hear it. Tap, tap, tap. No music, just footsteps. And a question. Was it ever really gone?